Lecture 8-2, Government in Action, Public Choice Theory. To briefly recap, in the first half of this lecture, we used economic reasoning to determine the appropriate role for government in the economy. Our standard was that government should undertake those activities for which the marginal benefits outweigh the marginal costs. Topping our list was establishing and maintaining the rule of law. And we took a moment to distinguish between the rule of law, the rule of man, and the rule of force. Next, we established that government, like the private sector, faces unlimited wants and needs with limited resources, scarcity, and that therefore it generates opportunity costs in making choices. Knowing that there are trade-offs to government action, then, we identified 3 conditions in which government action may generate marginal benefits in excess of marginal costs. We also noted that cynicism about government is not a new phenomenon. Bastiat's mid-19th century observation could easily have been written today. When the FTE wrote the Economics of Disasters curriculum, we found an echo of Bastiat in a Mercatus Foundation study of the public's evaluation of government response to Hurricane Katrina. The keys to understanding the undercurrent of dissatisfaction with government are found in economic reasoning propositions 3 and 4, incentives and institutions. The short story is that the rules of the game in government create different incentives than those in markets. Identifying those incentives and how they shape the behavior of people working in government will be our focus in this part of Lesson 8. There's a tendency to regard government decision-making as fundamentally different from private decision-making. It's almost as if we think that basic human nature is transformed and people become less self-interested and more altruistic when they enter public service. American Nobel economist James Buchanan effectively challenged this idea. Buchanan's name is usually associated with a subdiscipline of economics known as public choice theory, and he received his Nobel in the mid-1980s for applying economic reasoning tools to choices made by government officials and other actors in the public arena, candidates, lobbyists and interest groups, and even individual voters. Buchanan pointed out that basic human nature doesn't magically change when people enter the arena of government. They're still fundamentally self-interested, and they still choose the alternatives that they perceive to have the greatest benefits over costs as they pursue the projects that interest them. He argued that the key to understanding why it often seems that we don't get what we want from government starts by answering 2 questions. First, how do people in government define their self-interest? And second, how do the incentives in government institutions shape the choices they make in pursuing that self-interest? Briefly, we'll look at what Buchanan's work contributed to our understanding of the behavior of 4 groups of actors in government and the political process: elected officials, voters, lobbyists and special interest groups, and non-elected government employees or bureaucrats. Citizens express their preferences in government through voting. The analogy is consumers expressing their preferences by reacting to prices and buying or not buying in the market. In the market, this expression of preferences leads producers to use resources in their most highly valued ways and to produce particular goods and services only up to the point where marginal benefit equals marginal costs. We said earlier that the marginal benefit equals marginal cost guidelines should also apply to government, but it turns out that that's easier said than done, because government doesn't have a good feedback signaling mechanism like markets do. Generally speaking, when goods are produced by the market, we get high marginal benefits over costs without anyone controlling production, because of the producer's quest for profit. Prices and profits become the signals that facilitate this process. They provide information that firms need to make production decisions. Government, however, doesn't have a reliable source of information about marginal benefits and marginal costs of the projects it undertakes. Unlike the decentralized decision-making of the market, government provision of goods and services means that someone, a person or group of people, has to figure out what the costs and benefits are. Gathering the relevant cost data would be a daunting enough task, but how, in the absence of prices, are government decision makers going to calculate the benefits? The price that people are willing to pay for goods or services in the market is the best information we have about what they're worth. The government, of course, doesn't sell the goods and services it provides. It basically gives them away. So it doesn't have the information on value that the market collects and processes automatically. Government, as producer, then, must substitute other information like voting results. The process is supposed to be that citizens express their preferences by voting, and elected officials then make choices that reflect their constituents' preferences. Well, how well does voting work as an allocator of resources? Not perfectly is the best we can say about it. The process is complex, and there are too many places that it can go astray. First, voters need to know the benefits they would receive from government goods and services. That, in and of itself, is a shaky proposition. How do you calculate how much police and fire protection are worth to you? What about the value of public education or parks or recreation or the repaving of an interstate highway? And even if we suppose that individuals could accurately assess the value of government goods and services, then they have to find a politician whose preference matches theirs. They have to vote. Their politician has to win. And then their politician must actually write or support legislation the constituents want, and those wants must coincide with what other politicians' constituents want. We have a word for that. When you chart the course from voters to government provision of goods and services, there are many, many obstacles that can derail the message. Start with voting and the fact that many people don't. Long-term trends show voter turnout in the best case scenario hovering around 50%. Why don't people vote? Well, it's a cost-benefits calculation that economists call rational ignorance. And even though civics teachers spend a lot of time trying to convince us otherwise, the old excuse that my vote doesn't count anyway sums up the cost and benefit analysis pretty well. It's not rocket science to figure out that a single vote carries very little weight, especially given the huge size of the electorate at the national level. Translated into economic terms, this means that the additional benefit an individual gets from voting is very small, and non-voters can become free riders on the votes of people who have the same preferences as they do. Another problem is that the costs of being a voter in our society, especially an informed voter, are relatively high. It's hard to get accurate information through the campaign propaganda. You have to take time off work to go and vote. The lines are long. Although changes like early, absentee, and mail-in voting have reduced the cost somewhat, the comparison to the low benefits still results in relatively low voter participation. And really, we shouldn't be surprised. Now, before I move on to the incentives that affect other players in government, let me state emphatically that our saying low voter turnout is a result of rational ignorance is in no way intended as an argument that people shouldn't vote. It's just an explanation. People who don't vote perceive that the marginal costs outweigh the marginal benefits in terms of the outcome. If we're armed with that explanation and we still want to increase voter turnout, then the challenge is pretty clear. Change the equation by increasing the benefits or reducing the costs. And certainly, one of those benefits that we can teach our students is an appreciation of the fact that we do have the right to vote. So, if rational ignorance explains some voter behavior, what about behavior on the government side of the process? Do the preferences of all voters have equal chance of being translated into policy? Obviously not. To explain why, we have to go back to Buchanan's assertion that like actors in the market, elected officials in government also act in their self-interest. The pertinent question, however, is what do they perceive to be their self-interest? Now, before your mind equates self-interest with greed and wanders to bribery and corruption and influence peddling, ask yourself what, regardless of the character of the official, what has to happen first if he's going to act out his self-interest through government? Right, he's got to be in office. Altruistic or opportunistic, elected officials have to be elected and re-elected. That means that candidates and elected officials have a strong incentive to pay attention to the constituents and groups that can affect the outcome of elections. And that brings us to number 3 on our list, special interest groups and the lobbyists they hire to promote their special interests. The groups that can help candidates campaign or can deliver votes help the candidates advance their first self-interest, their desire to get into or remain in office. And if we look at Congress, for example, the evidence says that those groups are more likely to have representatives pay attention to their preferences. To the extent that this is true, the whole process of taking voter preferences and turning them into goods and services doesn't work very well. We tend to get legislation that benefits organized interest groups at the expense of the public at large. In public choice theory, this phenomenon has been labeled concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. When benefits are concentrated on a few, they have an incentive to get organized, be active politically, contribute money and effort to campaigns, and to vote in large percentages. And the elected officials have a strong incentive to pay attention to them and support the projects they support. On the other side of the fence, the costs are diffuse, meaning that they're spread out over so many people that there's little incentive for those people to oppose the projects. If the people bearing the costs are unlikely to organize or campaign or ultimately maybe even to vote, then the elected official has no incentive to worry about the cost he's imposed on them. For example, suppose regulations control the amount of sugar that can be imported into the United States each year, meaning that consumers pay higher prices for all products that contain sugar or sugar substitutes than they would if there were no restrictions on foreign sugar. Say the average person, like you, ends up paying over the course of a year $35 or $50 or even $100 more for food as a result. How many of you would join a special interest group, lead a protest in Washington, D.C., or even write a letter to your congressman? I'm betting that there aren't many hands up out there. And if there are, I'd have to ask, well, why haven't you? Because this isn't just a suppose. We do have restrictions on foreign sugar, and we do pay $30 to $50 more for food each year because of them. But I'm guessing you haven't opposed it, and certainly neither have I. The costs of doing so are far greater than the $50 spread out over the year in a few cents here and there. And you, like me, probably never think about it. But on the other side, what if you're a sugar beet farmer in Wyoming or a cane grower in Florida? Only about 2% of the U.S. population is farmers, and sugar farmers are only a small portion of that 2%. But the import restriction on sugar is worth thousands to tens of thousands to even hundreds of thousands of dollars to sugar growers depending on the size of their operation. And they know it, and they thus have a strong incentive to get involved when it comes time to renew trade legislation. Or think of our recent debate over public provision of health care and the involvement of organized groups like the AARP. Their members believe that they will benefit greatly from changes in healthcare provisions, and because these older, retired people are organized, because they lobby, because they contribute, and most importantly, because they vote in much larger percentages than the younger people who will bear the costs, they exert a great deal of influence in the legislative process. Now, let me be clear here. I'm sure there are crooks in politics just as there are crooks outside of government, and we all know stories of spectacular downfalls. But public choice observations about influence aren't about bribery or under-the-table dealing. Interest groups may, in fact, provide many legitimate benefits to elected officials in their efforts to get their agendas supported. One of the most important is funneling information to elected officials who face far too many issues with far too little time to investigate them. Special interest groups can also contribute not only money, but time to campaigns. And first and last, they turn out their members to vote. Farmers have one of the highest voting percentages of occupation groups, and older people one of the highest percentages of voter turnout by age. So we shouldn't be surprised that congressmen listen when farmers or retired people speak. Now, the process also works the other way. Call it concentrated costs and diffuse benefits. If the benefits of a government program are widely spread out, but the costs are concentrated, the group bearing the cost has an incentive to work against the legislation. For example, polls consistently tell us that an overwhelming majority of Americans favor stricter gun control. But most of those people see the benefits in abstract terms without immediate impact to them. In other words, the benefits are diffused. The costs, however, are concentrated on the smaller group of people who oppose stricter controls. Gun producers and retailers, hunters, gun collectors, people who feel strongly about the right to bear arms, like members of the NRA. So they have a strong incentive to work against the legislation. And not surprisingly, given their organization and voting turnout, they've been relatively successful in opposition. A corollary to the concentration and diffusion of costs and benefits has to do with the timeline in which they appear. Legislation that confers benefits now and imposes costs in the future is similar to legislation that diffuses costs over large groups, in that people have little incentive to oppose it, and elected officials have strong incentives to support it. Our national rhetoric over programs that increase the national debt and will be, quote, paid for by our grandchildren, deals with this very phenomenon. The future costs may very well be greater than the benefits now, but politicians know that people don't take future costs as seriously as they take present benefits. The flip side is that programs that impose costs now but don't provide benefits until some future time are unlikely to be enacted by representatives who are wary of voters' reactions to increased costs. Last on our list of actors in the government are unelected workers, bureaucrats, and civil service workers, and their ever-growing numbers and budgets and citizens' growing dissatisfaction with both their power and inefficiency. Everybody loves to gripe about bureaucrats. But what public choice theory teaches us is that the real problem isn't the people themselves. It's the incentives they face within the system. In a bureaucracy, there's no profit motive or competition to discipline use of resources. No pressure in government production, in schools, in government agencies, in legislatures to extract the full value of resources. And no rewards for innovators or risk takers. Simply put, to use a term that we introduced in Lesson 6, there's no residual claimant, someone who stands to benefit by cutting costs or coming up with innovative ideas. Now, if you work in public education, you know how this works. Think of your budget. Money unspent at the end of the year must be returned to central administration or the Treasury or wherever it originally came from. Experience quickly teaches you that turning back unspent money one year invites budget cuts for the following year. So I'd ask you, knowing the answer, how many of you who teach in public schools have large stashes of red pens in a closet somewhere, when what you'd really like to do is to accumulate the money for a few years and buy new textbooks or software? So, as you see, the incentives that exist within the system mean that the rational choice and standard operating procedure in government is to spend every penny in the budget, no matter how frivolous that purchase might look to someone on the outside. The rules of the game are use it or lose it. Plus, power and influence in bureaucracies is correlated to budget size, so you definitely don't want to have your budget stagnate or even worse, get cut, especially if you believe that your project is an important one that people need and benefit from. Before we leave the topic of government action in the economy, let's connect back to our concern with poverty. We've been looking at things that promote economic growth, but another alternative, and one that's being recommended by many influential people, celebrities and officials alike, is redistribution from the richer to the poorer. Now, whether redistribution is an effective response to poverty, not just in our country but on a world scale, is a matter of ongoing debate, but increasingly the evidence seems to be coming down on the side of those who say, no, it's not. And again, as an aside, if this is a topic of great interest to you, check out the FTE curriculum materials in the unit called Is Capitalism Good for the Poor? Nonetheless, governments do redistribute. In fact, all government activity in the economy has redistribution effects. But for now, let's just focus on programs designed specifically for that purpose, like welfare, Medicaid, school lunch programs, and World Poverty Aid. As we debate whether or not government ought to redistribute income, we should also pay attention to what has happened when we've tried to do so. Deliberate efforts by government to redistribute income often create incentives with unintended consequences, so they end up producing results contrary to the compassionate goals that initiated the redistribution. One example in our country is the historical data from the 20th century war on poverty, showing that aid to unmarried women with children actually resulted in more babies being born to single mothers, and not the improvement in child welfare that was intended. It's not easy to solve the problem of how we as a society reconcile our compassion for those suffering economic hardship with the incentives necessary to maintain a healthy, prospering economy. And while economic analysis can't magically tell us which trade-offs to accept, it does help us identify the trade-offs. And it can remind us that paying attention to incentives may help us avoid unintended consequences when we try to promote compassion through government action. A second problem with government redistribution is a phenomenon called rent-seeking, the use of resources to capture government largesse rather than in some productive enterprise that generates more wealth. It probably goes without saying that offering the benefits to be captured by rent-seeking behavior certainly works against the goal of economic growth that we've identified as the path out of poverty. With that then, we're at the end of the lectures for Topic 8, and here's a summary list of the key ideas we addressed in both lectures. 1. The most valuable role government performs in the economic struggle against scarcity is to establish and maintain the rule of law. It creates a protected, stable environment in which economic institutions can operate. Next, government should pursue those activities for which the marginal benefits exceed the marginal costs. Provision of public goods definitely meets this criterion, and marginal benefit may outweigh marginal costs when significant externalities exist or when firms can exercise market power. Next, the opportunity cost of more government spending is the private spending that is foregone. Public choice theory identifies the incentives that shape the behavior of elected officials, government workers, and politicians, and it helps to explain why those incentives lead to the expansion of government activities beyond the point where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And finally, the power of special interest groups is explained by the relative diffusion and concentration of costs and benefits of government programs, and by the understanding that elected officials' pursuit of self-interest begins with being elected or re-elected.